Arizona State University is located in Indian Country. There are 22 tribal nations in Arizona. ASU's campuses are situated on the homelands of many indigenous peoples, including the Akimel, O'odham, and Peepash.
Arizona State University recognizes the original inhabitants of these lands
and recognizes that they still reside throughout the Phoenix metropolitan area.
And we recognize the impact of their wisdom and generosity towards us.
If you've flown into the valley, you have undoubtedly seen the Salt River Project canals that surround the area.
Those modern-day canals follow the framework of the canals originally constructed by ancestral Sonoran Desert people, Huhulkan, to make this area both livable and a place where peoples could thrive.
We acknowledge that the modern-day indigenous nations that descended from the ancestral peoples are the original inhabitants of this land.
Good evening, and welcome to the Shaufler Prize in Journalism reception. We are delighted to come together this evening to celebrate the journalists who produce in-depth and long-form journalism and advance the understanding of issues related to underserved people in society, including communities of color, immigrants, and the LGBTQIA+ population. 2 years ago, Paul Anderson, principal and CEO of Seattle-based Workhouse Media, made a generous gift to the Cronkite School to establish the Shaufler Prize in honor of his dear friend, the late Ed Shaufler. Ed cared deeply about the stories of underrepresented communities, and his legacy lives on through Paul's gift and the impact it achieves. We are so pleased to welcome Paul to the Cronkite School tonight, and we extend our deepest gratitude to him for his incredible generosity, which makes this recognition of the best journalism in the country possible. Now in its second year, the Shaufler Prize in Journalism is a national contest open to professional journalists and students enrolled in full-time accredited journalism programs. Thanks to Paul's generosity, the contest awards $20,000 in cash prizes each year to first, second, and third place professional category winners, and a winning individual or team in the student category. This year, the Cronkite School received entries from across the nation with submissions from publications such as the New York Times, the Washington Post, NPR, ProPublica, and the Associated Press. Schools represented among this year's student entries include ASU, Syracuse, Berkeley, the University of Texas, Auburn, Howard University, San Diego State, and more. Professional category entries are reviewed and judged by a panel of reporters and editors from across the industry. Submissions in the student category are reviewed and judged by the faculty here at Cronkite and other journalism programs across the country. I would like to take a moment to acknowledge this year's panel of judges. In the professional category, Momo Chang, co-director of Oakland Voices. Kristen Gilger, Reynolds Professor in Business Journalism and at the Cronkite School and Director of the National Center on Disability and Journalism. Evelyn LaRubia, Investigative Editor for Technology and Business at the Washington Post. Nora Lopez, Executive Editor of the San Antonio Express News. 2021 Shaufler Prize in Journalism winner, Tolu Olorunipa, who is a White House bureau chief for the Washington Post. And Jeffrey Timmermans, the Donald W. Reynolds Chair in Business Journalism and Director of the Reynolds National Center for Business Journalism here at Cronkite. In the student category, Professor Nikki McLaren here at the Cronkite School. Marie Dillon, former Deputy Editorial Page Editor for the Chicago Tribune. And Adrian Flynn, Interim Director of the University of Maryland School of Journalism and the Capitol News Service Bureau. Thank you to this year's esteemed judges. Before we present this year's awards, I would like to invite Paul to the podium to share what inspired his vision for the Shaufler Prize in Journalism. Please join me in welcoming Paul Anderson.
Thank you, Dean Batts. Thank you, Dean Batts, and congratulations to the recipients of this year's Shaufler Prize in Journalism. Can you all hear me okay? All right, so I started this road trip 3.5 weeks ago, and I've been all over the country and just in from Los Angeles today, and I was out for a walk yesterday thinking about what I might say to you all, particularly since I was given a limit of 3 hours. I'm kidding, 5 minutes. And I was thinking about the conversations I had with Ed when Ed was here. And Ed died, he was 89 when he died in 2020. And even though we had this pretty big chasm of age difference, we just love to sit around and talk about bad journalism, great journalism. We decried sort of the shrinking newspapers in this country as they became thin. And then, because he and I were both business guys, we sort of lamented how media organizations sort of shot themselves in the foot by giving away so much of their content early on online, and didn't realize that so many people would migrate to online platforms. And what a bad business decision it was. Well, people finally recognized that maybe they could recover from that, and to the credit of the Cronkite School, to the credit of news organizations, including leaders in online, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and lots of local newspapers, journalism is back on the rise. But let me tell you what really got me thinking about this, because it relates to a conversation I had with Ed. When I was in college back in the 1980s, one of my favorite classes in history, which was one of my majors, was modern dictatorship. In that class, we studied 5 dictators: Napoleon I, Napoleon III, Hitler, Mussolini, and Stalin. All of those dictators, it was a year-long seminar class. We got to know so much about the character of each of those dictators. Some of them were incredibly charismatic. Some of them were painstakingly cruel. Some of them did reasonably good things. Napoleon III built tunnels really ostensibly to move his armies, but that became the basis for modern Paris. Very different personalities among those 5 dictators, those 5 white men. But let me tell you 3 things they all had in common. One is they were all egomaniacs. Number 2, they systematically went after marginalized communities, sexual minorities, financial minorities, ethnic minorities, religious minorities, to blame every ill in society on them. Those who had no voice and no ability to defend themselves. In Germany, obviously it was the Jews, and it was also gay people who had a pink triangle pasted on their doors so they could be taken away and executed. In Napoleon's time, they blamed religious and ethnic minorities who did not agree with the mainstream Catholic view, and they marginalized them and they killed them often. The third thing that they all had in common, all those crazy different personalities, the third thing they all had in common was they were each believed they were the sole proprietor of the truth. They controlled the messaging everywhere. And if you disagreed with whatever their messaging and narrative was, you were, in the kindest moment, put into a labor camp, and not so kind, you were killed. I don't know if the journalism school here studies sort of the tenets of 17th century philosopher John Locke. John Locke was an English philosopher who wrote the Essays on Democracy, which really became the foundation for what our founders created in the Declaration of Independence, with James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, but also the tenets of our Constitution. John Locke warned, he died in 1704. He was long dead, 70 plus years before before we actually declared independence from our captors, the Brits. He warned that free thought is what free people. Our democracy, our very survival depends upon free speech and the First Amendment and free expression, not only of what we say, how we communicate, who we love, all of that. Politics aside, I think we have all seen characteristics in dictatorships that exist today of these 5 dictators who existed so long ago. Blaming marginalized groups, controlling the one truth that they determine we all need to know and that we need to follow. Well, hallelujah for the democracy we live in and the strength of our First Amendment, and that is why the Shaufler Prize exists, to avoid going down the rabbit hole of fascism, going down the rabbit hole of being controlled. So our voices as Americans first, you all as journalists, I'm not a journalist, they matter. And so when Ed and I used to sit around at his house here in Phoenix and we would lament the sort of the thin journalism, we also reveled in stories we would read in the New York Times and the Washington Post, and even occasionally the Arizona Republic when they actually funded a long-form investigative piece, because that was food for our souls. And that enlivened us. That encouraged our confidence in our democracy. So that's why this matters. That's why what you all are studying, that's what you all are achieving as professional journalists, and what you all are achieving as educators of the next generation of journalists. That's why the Shaufler Prize exists. And that's my pleasure to spend some of my good fortune on this prize. And congratulations to everyone who's winning this year. And I am excited about the following years. And of course, you all are going to be called upon to judge and help with next year's prize. So sorry to take up more than 5 minutes, but I just wanted to tell you why this exists. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. We are now excited to present this year's winners with their awards. When I announce your name, come to accept your award and please remain on stage. The Shaufler Prize winner in the student category goes to students from the Howard Center for Investigative Journalism at the University of Maryland and students from Professor Maggie Mulvihill's computational journalism class at Boston University for their story, Mega Billions, the Great Lottery Wealth Transfer. This was an exploration of how state lotteries intentionally sucked wealth out of poorer, often Black or Hispanic neighborhoods, transferring billions of dollars to multinational companies no longer based in the United States. I believe we have some members from the winning student team with us on live stream. We certainly wish you could be here with us in person this evening, but congratulations on your well-deserved recognition. And now, our professional prize winners. In third place, Susan Ferris, former investigative journalist at the Center for Public Integrity, who is now senior editor at the Pulitzer Center, and Joe Girardi, data reporter at the Center for Public Integrity, for their data-based investigation, Cheated at Work, which examined how vulnerable guest workers are being shorted on pay while in the U.S. for seasonal low-wage jobs.
We're already getting this wrong.
Yeah,
Were we supposed
right.
to stand?
All right.
I'll get on the other.
Yeah.
In second place is Jamie Smith Hopkins and a podcast team with Transmitter Media for The Wealth Vortex, a long-form story and accompanying 5-episode podcast that followed the efforts of Iowa entrepreneur Rashonda Young to address a racial gap in her hometown of Waterloo, Iowa. Accepting the award on behalf of Jamie and the team is Janine Jones, design editor at the Center for Public Integrity. And the first place winner of this year's Shaufler Prize in Journalism is Ida Lee Campa, reporter for Inside Climate News, for her 3-part series, The Superfund Site Next Door, Toxins and Mistrust in Atlanta. This explored how residents of predominantly Black communities in Atlanta's West Side grappled with the EPA's 2022 designation of their neighborhoods as a Superfund site. Congratulations to all of our Shaufler Prize in Journalism winners and these outstanding journalists. It is now my pleasure to introduce this evening's moderator of our panel discussion, Pauline Arriaga, who is the executive editor of the Carnegie Knight News 21 initiative here at the Cronkite School. Pauline is an award-winning writer and editor who joined the Cronkite School in 2019 as a professor of practice to launch the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Southwest Health Reporting Initiative, a program that increases reporting of health disparities in underserved communities and communities of color. Before coming to the Cronkite School, Pauline spent 27 years at the Associated Press, most recently as the head of the U.S. Enterprise Journalism team. We are excited to have Pauline lead an engaging conversation with our prize winners. Pauline.
Well, thank you so much. I forgot that there's a clock up there, so I'm going to keep my eyes on the time so that we don't go too far over. First of all, congratulations to each of you. I've spent a lot of time going through your stories. We'll talk a little bit more about some of the takeaways I had, and I hate to say some of the weight of the world that I felt on my shoulders after reading about some of these issues that you covered. But look, I'm not sure whether everyone's had the opportunity to read these entries. I hope if you've not, that you take the time. As a Latina, as a journalist, as a professor, these are issues that are so near and dear to my heart. And as Paul touched on, these are issues that often are overlooked in society and in mainstream media. So thank you, not just congratulations, thank you for writing these stories. Please, please, please continue on with this amazing work. It's fantastic. So we're going to have a little bit of a conversation with our panelists here and our winners here today. I'm going to plant the seed. This is what I do with my own students. We are going to open this up for questions in just a little while. Guess what that means? That means we really want some questions. So you have an opportunity to sit here and think about some questions because we do want to hear from you. This is your opportunity, if you're a student here at Cronkite, to hear from some of the best journalists in the country doing really, really important work on communities of color and underserved communities. And I know that you all will have a lot of questions for them, okay? So, seed planted. So I want to start with this. We know everyone in the audience perhaps has not had the opportunity to read your work. So I want you to start by telling us a little bit about the impetus for these particular stories. I know several of you are beat reporters, whether it's immigration, environmental justice. In the case of Jamie, who's not here, Jamie long reported on the wealth gap, right? But it's one thing to go from these very, very broad beats to the very specific stories that you all wrote. So if you can talk about how you arrived at these particular topics and stories, and in doing so, can you talk a little bit about the piece itself? And Susan and Joe, I'm gonna actually start on the far end with you all and then move on down the line. And you should have some microphones, I believe, near you.
Is it on?
It's on.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Pauline, and thanks. It's great to see all these students here, and I know of the great work that you all do. So Joe and I had collaborated before on stories about immigrant workers. And this particular story is about guest workers who are often kind of combined, but they're not really, because they don't stay in the United States. They come seasonally. And actually, I probably first reported on guest workers 30 years ago. So it's something I've kind of followed for many years. But in today's world, you have incredible access to data, which can, really inspire a lot of great stories. And Joe, as a data reporter, analyzed, and I'll let him talk about that. We worked together, but he did all the great analysis. We worked together on, looking at what mattered in this massive amount of data from the U.S. Department of Labor. And in this particular set of data, it was looking at complaints about wages that were owed. And these were cases that were closed. So there had been reason found for these complaints to be filed. They were justified. And so one of the interesting things about this data is it included the visa that people were admitted under. So you could see if someone was an H-2A worker, that's a person who does agricultural work. An H-2B worker does other kinds of seasonal work. So we were able to really drill down on the trends that the data showed. And I had been following what was going on with the growth of these programs, which have grown tremendously. They grew during President Trump's term, despite his rhetoric about, foreigners taking jobs away. His own businesses employ guest workers. But it was interesting to see how the complaints the numbers filed weren't really keeping up. So in doing just, beat reporting, talking to sources I found out more about weird new schemes that employers were coming up with to not only just rip off people, not pay them overtime, not pay them, wages they were due, but also find ways to use the visa system to tweak it and actually pay them far less than they should get paid. And we hope that the story explains a lot about this system.
And Susan, when you say far less, your lead character, if I'm remembering correctly, made $5 an hour, is that right, in the garment industry, versus what is the minimum wage in California?
Well, that was a figure that's from a survey that people were making, and these guest workers that were making, I'll quickly sum up one example. Guest workers who were brought in to drive trucks for a sugarcane company were paid probably 40% less than the actual job that people do truck driving in the area that they were in Louisiana. And the way that the company was able to do that is they filed for getting guest workers. It's a complicated system with the Department of Labor involved and the State Department. They filed for them to come in as farm workers, when in reality, and that they were able to pay them a lower wage because the lower prevailing wage in Louisiana for a farm worker is far less than a truck driver. Mm. So for multiple years, these drivers were driving these trucks and sometimes driving 60 hours a week and never getting overtime because farm workers don't get overtime. And they were also making like half the wage.
Yeah, and I'm going to circle back at the end because we do, of course, want to talk about impact, the impact that this work has had. Joe, is there anything that you wanted to add in terms of just sort of how you all started out on this particular project?
Yeah, sure. I mean, Susan did a great job really talking about, I think, most of it. But I just want to say that this story was part of a larger series that focused on wage theft in many different industries among many different vulnerable communities, not just guest workers. But it all came from this database that we were able to get through a Freedom of Information Act request to the Department of Labor. And I think it's really probably to Susan's credit that she kind of said when we actually got the data and we started looking through it, she noticed that, hey, among other types of violations, there are these ones that specifically mention these different visa categories. And from there, we were able to flesh out a story focused solely on the difficulties that folks on these visa categories had getting justice when they were cheated of their pay.
I love that because, as we know, there are a lot of stories that can start with the data, and there are a lot of stories that start with the person. I'm perhaps assuming, but Janine, I know you're not the reporter of the next story that we're going to talk about, but can you talk a little bit about how Jamie arrived at this incredible tale of one woman seemingly trying to solve the wealth gap problem, at least in Waterloo, Iowa.
Right.
No small task.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
So the Center for Public Integrity, our mission is to investigate inequality, and the wealth gap in America is at the forefront, is right there. So since the 1960s, the wealth gap between white families and specifically black families has actually grown. It hasn't gotten less, it's actually gotten much worse. And so Jamie, I don't know how she found Rashonda Young, the woman who we followed, Rashonda Young. She lives in Waterloo, Iowa, and she decided to start the first, it would be the first because it's the only black-owned bank in Iowa. I don't know how Jamie came upon Rashonda, but that's how we talk about and discuss the wealth gap through Rashonda's plan and path to create the first black bank in Iowa.
Yes, and let's keep the secret of what's happening now until the end.
Yes.
Okay. With this bank, because I have to say, after I finished reading the story, I immediately Googled the bank because I had to know what was happening with the bank. If you all need to read an amazing narrative story that perfectly blends so many facts and stats and numbers and details with just such a compelling, powerful story, you need to read this one. I'm going to use it next week, probably, with my News 21 students. Great. Ida Lee, absolutely. Last but not least on this one.
So it was evolving. I honestly didn't know what I was getting into, but I knew I wanted to go to this neighborhood in Atlanta because my editor said there's this thing happening, there's contamination in this neighborhood, and she's from Atlanta, and so she said, okay, there's contamination of lead, and I know what's around there, and I know this community. Can someone go and see what this means and what they're thinking? So we didn't know what was going to come out of it. Honestly, as someone who had just finished an investigative journalism program here, I was like, I'm going to go and figure out who did this. It was so unrealistic, but I learned a lot. And what ended up happening was that I wasn't reporting on the EPA as much as I was reporting on what the residents ended up feeling about the situation, which was, we've known that it's been contaminated for the longest time, and we've felt that no one's cared, and we've felt that there's only attention here now because it's a place of interest for investment. Mm-hmm. And so they're not saying the EPA is doing this for that, but they're hesitant. And so when the EPA came knocking on their door, they said, what do you want from me? Do you want to take out all my dirt and replace it? Wait, you want to take samples of my blood to see if I have lead? Right. And it was just too much to ask for a place that didn't have trust in the government anymore.
And I'm going to circle back with a follow-up question for you, but a little birdie did tell me that when we're talking about how the story even sort of began, I don't know, did you start reporting on this perhaps when you were at ASU? Could you talk about that a little bit?
I finished the MAIJ program here in December and became a fellow through the Howard program at Inside Climate. And I think because I was a fellow, I was able to pursue this because I didn't have an assigned beat. So in Slack, when someone shared the story and said, who wants to do it? I was like, me. And so it worked out that way. I don't know if I would have been able to do that now in my permanent position.
That is amazing. I love it. I love when editors or whomever threw that in Slack, and everyone, I've always done this. I reporter shop. Who wants this? Who wants this? Who wants this? And then it's like crickets until the super smart person goes, I do. And then look at what you did. That's amazing. I don't know if they're watching, but I do want to shout out the Howard Center at the University of Maryland, because if you have not read this story about lotteries, holy cow. And it's not one story, it's a very, very big series about this, but it is absolutely stunning work. I desperately wanted to ask them how they came upon this idea and landed on it and so on and so forth, but they're not here. But if you haven't read it, please do, because it is outstanding work Students, professionals, I don't care. It's one of the best pieces I've read all year. So please read it. All right, so a couple of more questions before we go to the audience here. Each of these stories, each one, touches not just on the now, right, but on the very, very complicated history that led to these problems. And I often tell my students, especially when you're reporting on underserved communities and communities of color, you really have to be in tune and in touch with that complicated history, right? Obviously, they also touch on the idea of mistrust. Mistrust of the government coming into their neighborhoods, mistrust of the banking and lending system, of working with investigators or regulators who may actually be trying to help. So can you talk a little bit about what you all found in your reporting around what drives some of that mistrust, and then also how do we overcome it? What did you learn through your reporting? And Ida Lee, I do want to start with you because your story was centered around that whole theme of mistrust. That was the theme of the story. And so what I ended up doing as someone who's not from Atlanta, obviously not Black, and so I really needed to dig deep to understand what led to the mistrust instead of just quoting it. My incredible editor recommended talking to historians. So I did talk to historians that specialized in environmental justice in the South, specifically in urban areas after, or that were heavily industrial. Mm-hmm. And so I spoke with historians, and that was where it started. And then I spent a lot of time in historical archives and online libraries looking at redlining maps, looking at any maps that told me anything about this community so far, looking at drawn maps from the late 1800s. And so I was able to confirm for a fact where this council member lived, there was an industrial facility right there. Okay. And now he lives there, and it's on the intersection of Foundry Street and whatever else it was called. And so that, and then talking to residents and saying, who do I need to talk to? Who knows this community? And they led me to them. It was, a lot of times it's church leaders, it's former elected officials. And so if I'm able to go to a resident and say, I've already talked to all these people, that already gains a little bit of trust. And then I, of course, had to be there. I couldn't report on it from Phoenix. I was living in Phoenix at the time, and so I went there twice. The first time I understood the hesitance. The second time I showed up at a church and they're like, yeah, she's doing her thing. They kind of, I was doing a series, and so I put out the first story and then came back. So I was very nervous because I had known that they had read the first one. And so I was like, if I mess up that first one, I'm not going to be let in anymore. And I went to a church event in which they were, giving out information about this, and I saw the source who kind of was central to my story. And I said, did you read the story? And she said, I did. And then she looked at me, she's like, it was good. Good job. And she gave me more information. I was like, okay, I did it. So you need to be there. You can't do it online. Excellent advice. And with all of that research, how much of that did you do before you started talking to people?
I don't know, a lot.
A lot? Yeah. A lot, because you got to do that research before you start talking to people. Mm-hmm. Does anyone else want to chime in on just kind of the history, the mistrust?
Sure. Do you want to? I can do a little bit for Jamie. I know, like I said, I don't know how Jamie met Rashonda, but I do know that she talked to her. They had a standing meeting every week, I believe, long before we even decided that this was going to be a podcast, that this was going to be a 5-part series. Building trust with your sources in this story was paramount. Like it was the only way that you can do it. Rashonda opened and has continued to open up her journey with us, with Jamie, to let us know what's going on and the hurdles that she faces. the things that perhaps that she did wrong, that she might have would change to make it a little bit easier, if you will. So I know that it started months, even before knowing what this project actually was going to be, that Jamie and Rashonda would talk all the time about where Rashonda was in her journey.
Yeah, and I will say, again, that story included just so much history around the systemic racism, not just in Iowa or in Waterloo, but across the country that led to the wealth gap and that, created the problem that, again, the character was attempting to solve. Just amazing. And Susan and Joe, anything else?
Well, yes, I think low-wage foreign workers, immigrants, or guest workers are inherently more vulnerable to exploitation. So you've got to recognize that, and since I've been covering this for a long time, I know a lot of people who are organizers among immigrant and guest workers in various states and in Mexico. And so that helps. So they tell me about things and introduce me to people. And, many people don't want to talk about what's happening to them on the record, and I respect that because, chances are it may not help them at all. But I think for a lot of stories, for example, this particular story, there is so much documentation you can use. And in fact, I did this story primarily on the phone and calling people in Mexico, calling people in around the U.S., where some of them were still working, talking to their lawyers. And a lot of it's an investigative story. So there were a lot of allegations in legal papers, in complaints that people had filed. The lead of the story are crayfish packers in Louisiana, and who all got sick. They were guest workers. They all got sick from COVID. They couldn't work, so they lost wages, but they shouldn't have. The employer should have paid them. And then they had all sorts of disputes. And they actually, a couple of them were very courageous, and they filed a complaint. The story explains how they lost their first round, and they actually had to leave the country. And, but they want to come back.
And Susan, when you say they had to leave the country?
They had to leave the country because they lost their status as visa holders because they left their workplace. And so I try to explain these complicated barriers and limitations and problems that workers face with these programs. They're quite complex, and there's different agencies that regulate them. But it was really great to be able to speak to people in Mexico who, there's been over the years a lot more organizing among cross-border organizing among workers in states where entire villages send people as guest workers. And they've begun to organize and try to encourage each other to stick up for one another. And so I found that that had evolved really dramatically from what I first started reporting in Mexico. Yeah. So I try to explain that and bring in their voices because they're very instrumental in helping people.
Yeah, and again, not just a fear of exploitation, but of deportation as well. I do want to begin to open this up to the audience. So we have a microphone here. If you all do have questions, and I'm very hopeful that you do, please go ahead and come on up and approach the microphone. I'm happy to continue talking, as anyone out there who knows me knows. But I would love to have some questions from the audience. So please do approach the microphone if you have any. One, because I wanted to come back to this, impact. What impact, if any, have your stories had? But not only that, are you continuing to follow them because has anyone agreed to more testing by the EPA in Atlanta? We got to find out what's happening with the bank. And then same thing, I'm really, really curious in California and some of the other states, and California, of course, already has more regulation than a lot of other states, right? But whether anything is happening in terms of the regulatory aspects of the wage theft. So who wants to go first? Oh, come on, don't make me call on you. Okay, Idly.
Well, after I wrote the first story and I came back, there was, at a church, they were, trying to recruit more people to sign up for a study to see if they had high lead levels and if they wanted to sign up to get their house tested or land tested. And the city council member was there, and I was like, oh, hi, nice to see you again. And he said, I'm here because the EPA called me after they saw your story, and they asked, have you gotten your blood tested? Have you done all the things you're talking about in that story? And so he signed up, got his blood tested, did the whole, everyone come out. He hadn't partnered with them. So that was kind of nice to see.
So wait, the EPA was using your story to get people to get tested?
Just him, because I know they weren't happy about my story, but yeah, so that was nice. Unfortunately, the Emory University, who's still doing research on blood level testing, when I reached out to them actually a couple days ago, she said they're still struggling a lot. Even after people sign up, there's not a lot of follow through. So the blood testing has been the most difficult part. So that's where I'd like to follow up and learn more. I'm hoping this has more impact as there's more funds from the Biden administration that's being handed out for environmental justice and for Superfund sites, that this is taken into account as those are being dispersed at a local level, that you can't just kind of give a check. There's more that needs to be done, but.
Again, I'm so glad that the entire theme of your story was mistrust, because whether we're talking about COVID vaccinations, whatever it may be, there is so much mistrust in communities of color. And we can go back to the Tuskegee experiments. So yeah, the idea of giving blood, doing anything like that, there's a reason, again, why people are hesitant. So are you going to keep following up on it? We hope?
Yes, I want to.
Okay. Thumbs up. All right, impact.
So
next steps.
So Rashonda is still trying to open up the bank, and on March 29th, we are having a live event at publicintegrity.org where we talk to her on a call. Anyone can join if you go to our website. And she's going to update us on exactly the additional hurdles that she has faced along the way. She has raised more money. I believe I forget how much money you have to raise, but she hasn't raised all of it yet. So she will, in fact, herself give you where she is in her journey of opening up the bank in Iowa. And you can go to our website on March 29th, and you can sign up to be a part of that and hear firsthand from her.
One of the greatest narrative techniques I've ever seen. You go through the story waiting to see, did she open the bank? I just had to know. Okay. And Susan, Joe?
Well, recently the Department of Labor proposed some, I believe, guidelines for when folks who are in the country on on work visas such as this, that they do file claims against employers, that they'll have added protections against deportation or against having to leave the country. That was announced, what was it, last month or 2 months ago? Yeah.
That's pretty amazing.
I will say to the truck drivers that were ripped off, that worked for the sugarcane company, got a settlement.
Okay.
I mean, this is something that companies do too, right? They admit no guilt. So they fought it at first in court, and then more truck drivers began joining this class action, and the company settled. But the attorneys for the truck drivers can't talk about it. That was one of the conditions.
But did they settle after the story came out?
Yeah.
That's fabulous. Okay, well, they don't have to talk about it then. Really? We have a room full of journalists, not one question? Oh, yeah, okay. Please say your name, what you're studying, and go for it. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Udam, and I'm currently a graduate student here. First of all, congratulations again for winning the prize. I believe that you have done really admirable work. I wish I had read your articles before I came here, but I'll do that afterwards. But my question is, because I believe that investigative pieces, and especially like longer pieces, you started off feeling very motivated, seeing the titles and, really inspired to read through, and you're halfway through and you got tired, and that's what happens to me. So my question to you is, like, how have you, or what tactics or what steps that you take in order to make it more reader-friendly, because not everybody have the rigor to read investigative pieces, especially longer ones. So I just want to know that. Yeah, thank you.
That's a great question.
It helps to break it up into a series. I think focusing on the narrative and the characters are going to drive everything. If you have a lot of details just for the sake of the details to make it sound cool, it's not going to work unless you have really compelling characters, because then you're invested in the banker or who wants to open a bank. You're invested in, did the community get tested? But if you're just describing other details that are not around that, then it's hard to get invested as a reader, I think, at least in my opinion.
Yeah, I think that's all right. I think you do have to concentrate on the narrative, and you need to remember it's storytelling and rewriting. A lot of people think it's a sign of failure if you have to rewrite a story. No, it's a chance to make it better. It's important to do that and to look at, as your story's rolling along, what can you do to punctuate, a section and then set up the next one and use subheads. I think too, digitally, a lot of very interesting stuff is done with graphics and ways to break up things, put things in charts or different form of storytelling. But I think the story is really important. I also think, if you want to have impact, you do have to reach people that don't think like you. That you want to provide evidence, and sometimes that can get boring. You using a lot of numbers, but I think in rewriting you can find ways to set those off with human stories wrapped around it, bring people in and have good quotes that set it up, relevant quotes. So I think there's ways of doing that, but if you want to have impact, sometimes you do have to include things that are boring. I kind of feel like you do have to be an amateur lawyer sometimes. Think about what you would put forth as evidence if you're trying to convince someone who's a skeptic. So you do have to do your reporting, but then also remember it's a story.
That's a great analogy. All writing is rewriting, by the way. That's a bumper sticker, it should be. Or behind every single data point, every number, every investigation, a human being, okay? Any other questions before I turn this back over to Dean Batts? Oh, please. Let us know who you are.
My name is Anna. I'm a freshman at the Cronkite School, so I don't quite know what I want to do yet, but we're figuring that out.
That's fine. You know what? Half the journalists in the world still don't know what they really want to do, so go ahead.
I know that stories this good only come from moments when you feel really passionate about what you're writing, and I know how awesome it feels to feel really passionate about what you're writing. What do you guys think was some important steps that you took in your career to be able to get to a point where you could write these stories that you were really passionate about?
Well, I'll just say, frankly, being part of a team that you really like and working with colleagues who are dedicated, intelligent, I think is a big part of it. So I was very happy that I got to work with Susan on that, and our editors at Public Integrity were excellent. So I think that's just a huge part of it, right? Like waking up and saying, I feel good because even though the story is very difficult, even though, we're having a lot of trouble getting the information we need from from government agencies, let's say, or lawyers or what have you, companies. It motivates you when you say, I know that there's also other people here working on this who are working hard, just being part of that team. I think it's a great way to motivate you and kind of keep you moving through the tough times.
Thanks. Thank you so much. Any other questions? Oh my goodness, we've got one more. Dean Batts, is that okay? Okay, come on up, come on up, come on down. I feel like I'm a game show host. Come on down.
Thank you. My name is Caden. I'm a junior this year. With any investigative long-form reporting, I always feel like the thing that probably happens is you have so much that you aren't able to include in your coverage. You obviously try to include the most important things, but even sometimes that gets cut out. Is there something from the reporting that you guys have done and that you've talked about today that you wish you could have included in your article and your coverage? Because I'm just curious, so more of a fun question, but thank you.
Our editor's watching. No, go ahead.
I think for me, it was the background research that I was doing. The historical research of the community was fascinating to me. But just because it's fascinating to you is not necessarily new information for a lot of people. And so I had to learn that was helping me report on the stuff that was actually going to be in the story. So it still served its purpose. But there was a lot of killing of my babies, unfortunately. So that's what the editor is there for. But yeah, it was cut a lot. And I had to realize that same thing, like this story is for the community too, and I don't want the community to be like, yeah, no, duh, we've known this. So,
yeah. Anyone else on that one?
Sometimes you don't. This story, I feel like both of us were able to put in what we thought was most important. We spent a lot of time thinking about that. God, there's more regulations with this program, guest worker program, than you can imagine, so you can't possibly put all of them in. There was one line I think I took out, which was about how some tweak in that Congress did doesn't allow guest workers who are H-2B workers, non-agricultural, to use any kind of legal aid group, the help of a legal aid group that gets federal funding, which is really kind of super mean,
yeah.
Isn't it? But I think I had to take that out. It just kind of didn't fit in perfectly. But I feel like sometimes you can put things in that you think should be in, like the history behind this program really starts with the Bracero program, which was really important in Arizona, to the Mexican guest worker program that started during World War II. Basically California, Arizona, the Braceros built our American food industry, the biggest in the world, really, in the West. So I thought it was important to put that in, but you don't need to put in everything. You can put in, a boiled down line that's strong. And I think sometimes you have to remember too in writing, even if you feel insecure about something, you need to learn enough so you can feel secure saying it. You have to have an authoritative voice. It doesn't mean you're being opinionated, but you boil something down, clear language, and say what you think. And even now, after this many years of doing this, I get caught up sometimes in, trying to over-explain things. And sometimes you need to step back and decide, okay, how am I going to tell this to someone like I'm sitting across the table from them?
I say that every single week. Y'all, thank you so much. I think we all learned a lot. And again, for those of you in the room, if you have not yet had the opportunity to read this work, including, again, shouting out the Howard Center at the University of Maryland, please, please, please take a look at this work, because you learn by looking at how others are doing it, right? And the work that they've done here, fantastic examples of blending really, really, really great investigative journalism with true storytelling. And again, wrapping in interesting details in history and tucking it all into a really, really fabulous story. So judges, you all picked some fabulous, fabulous stories here. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pauline, for leading such a wonderful discussion. Let's hear it again for our winners of the Shaufler Prize in Journalism. Congratulations to all of you, and thank you again for all the hard work that you do. I would like to also once again recognize Paul Anderson and express our sincere gratitude for your generosity and trust that you have placed in us for the Shaufler Prize. This really means a lot to us to have you here and to have your support. So thank you again. And so we're already looking ahead to next year. So if you are a student, you need to be paying close attention to September, which is when we will start to open the entries for the 2023 Shaufler Prize in Journalism. So we're looking forward to next year already. And until then, thank you again for coming tonight. This ends our celebration.